The story of colonial South Africa begins in 1652. In this year, the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. The station was meant to supply ships on their way to Asia. This event marked the beginning of a long and complex history. It led to the colonization of South Africa by Europeans. The arrival of the Dutch and later other Europeans had a profound impact on the indigenous people of South Africa. The indigenous population was made up of various groups. These included the San, the Khoikhoi, and the Xhosa people. Europeans gradually took over land. They displaced the indigenous communities who had lived there for centuries. The Dutch settlers viewed the indigenous population as inferior. They exploited them for labor. They also introduced diseases that ravaged the native populations. This set a pattern of racial discrimination. Sadly, this pattern would continue for centuries. The Dutch colony at the Cape grew slowly at first. It relied on slaves from other parts of Africa and Asia. The Dutch settlers also began to move inland. They clashed with indigenous groups over land and resources. This marked the start of a long conflict. It would shape the future of South Africa. In 1795, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch. The British sought to control this strategic location. It was important for their trade routes to India. The British takeover led to significant changes in South Africa. The British brought their own laws and customs. They abolished the slave trade in 1807. This angered many Dutch settlers, known as Boers, who relied on slave labor. The British administration also implemented policies that favored British settlers. They often disregarded the rights of both the indigenous population and the Boers. This led to growing resentment among the Boers. They felt increasingly marginalized in their own land. In the 1830s, tensions reached a boiling point. Thousands of Boers seeking to escape British rule and maintain their way of life embarked on the Great Trek. They migrated eastward into the interior of South Africa. This migration had a significant impact on the political and social landscape. The Boers established their own independent republics. These were the South African Republic, or Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. They clashed with indigenous groups, leading to further displacement and conflict. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 transformed South Africa. It sparked a gold rush that attracted people from all over the world. The discovery of gold and diamonds had profound consequences. It intensified existing tensions between the British and the Boers. It led to the South African War from 1899 to 1902, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War. The Boers, skilled marksmen fighting on their own terrain, initially had the upper hand. However, the British, with their superior numbers and resources, eventually prevailed. The war had a devastating impact on the Boers. They lost their independence. Their republics were annexed by the British. The war also witnessed the British use of brutal tactics. Thousands of Boer civilians, including women and children, were interned in concentration camps. These camps suffered from disease and malnutrition. In 1910, after years of negotiation, the Union of South Africa was formed. This unified the four British colonies, the Cape, Natal, Transvaal and Orange Free State. The Union was established as a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. The formation of the Union marked a turning point. However, it did not resolve the fundamental issue of racial equality. The Union's constitution effectively disenfranchised black South Africans. It cemented the political and economic dominance of the white minority. In 1948, the National Party, a white Afrikaner nationalist party, came to power. They formalized the country's existing segregationist policies into a system of racial segregation and discrimination known as apartheid. Apartheid was more than just segregation. It was a system designed to ensure white minority rule and the suppression of the black African majority. Apartheid laws touched every aspect of life, from residence and employment to education and marriage. Black South Africans were treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The implementation of apartheid sparked widespread resistance. Black South Africans, along with their allies within the country and internationally, refused to accept this injustice. Organizations like the African National Congress, or ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC, mobilized the population. They organized protests, strikes, and acts of defiance against the apartheid regime. The apartheid government responded with brutal force, imprisoning, torturing and killing thousands of people. Key figures like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu and Steve Biko became symbols of resistance. Their sacrifices inspired millions both within South Africa and around the world. International pressure and sanctions against South Africa grew. The country became increasingly isolated. After decades of struggle, negotiations between the apartheid government and the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, began in the late 1980s. These talks led to the unbanning of political parties like the ANC, the release of political prisoners, and ultimately the end of apartheid. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela was elected the country's first black president, marking the beginning of a new era. The transition from apartheid to democracy was a remarkable achievement. However, the legacy of apartheid continues to cast a long shadow over South Africa. The country still grapples with high levels of poverty, inequality and social unrest, issues rooted in its history of colonialism and racial oppression.